4th of August 1945. When had Thomas last seen her? Was her disaffected visit the last time? He closed his eyes for a moment, and then tried to picture her face. "Mr. Barrow?" Chadwick asked. "Mr. Jack Prue." Thomas stopped walking. Dr. Chadwick stopped too. Around them, the sound of a blackbird singing lazily in the warmth of the day, adding to the happy vision of a summer's day. He was the butler to Milo's aunt, who came over in the 20s, as an evacuee from Ireland, he told Chadwick. "Why? What has he to do with this?" Chadwick lowered his brow. "Tell me, why are the letters dated after Milo's death?" Chadwick hesitated, and then shook his head. "Not yet, Mr. Barrow," he told Thomas. "I will tell you, but not yet. In several days, you will understand why." Thomas looked down into his hand again. Why was he holding dozens of letters that Milo had sent to him, and had never arrived? A sudden urge to tear off from the man, to sit, alone, with Milo's words overcame him. Thomas held fast, and began to walk again. When had he seen her? Had it been when she had heard of Chadwick's Nobel Prize? Milo had been pleased, no, ecstatic about this. It was a dull mood that Thomas had caught her in, at the cottage, looking for him at the cottage for some reason. She had been angry with him, really angry. Thomas had tried to speak to her, and she had calmed down. Her second father, Rutherford, had died, and she was distressed. But she was agitated, too, for some other reason. They had parted ways since Thomas's attempted suicide. Milo had spent her time between Cambridge and Germany, or Denmark. Thomas had gone to America, until the Wall Street crash. Guy had lost all his money. Thomas had supported him, doing odd jobs. But it was too much for him, in the end, and he had died. Thomas, devastated at the loss of his lover, worked his way back across America to New York, in houses and hotels, until he had enough for his passage home. But it was too much to go back to Downton. Lord Grantham was ill, and over the course of 5 years he had deteriorated, until, Lady Mary had told Thomas confidentially, it had been a relief to see him go. And then, she of all people, had invited Thomas back to be butler, Master George making it permanent when he took over the running of the estate on gaining his title and money, at 21. It did not stop Lord Grantham's grandson, however, being old enough at 18 to enter the war, nor flying in what was now being called, the Battle of Britain. Thomas had been delighted to accept. And that had been 1943. 2 months later, Thomas had had his telegram informing him about Milo's death. It was not like he had not written. Had Milo even got his letters? He'd sent them to Cambridge, so he assumed so. But, perhaps his had never made it to Milo, as hers had not made it to Thomas. No, there had been another time he had seen Milo. It was just when he had arrived back in England, and he had been telephoned by Chadwick about their announcement of the neutron discovery. And Thomas had seen her, but not for long, before Milo went back to Göttingen. "Take your time, Mr. Barrow," Chadwick told him. "It is a lot to take in, given the circumstances." He glanced to the letters in his hand again, as they rounded the formal gardens and took the path across the lawn to the woods. 88,888,888. While Barrow was in the gardens of Downton Abbey, George had decided to take a walk of his own, over the fields and to the cottages, one of which he dearly hoped to garner answers from, or at least, some sort of insight. For it was all too far away, the time Barrow had told him, when this woman, Lucina Ashby, had lived, had worked at Downton. He must have only been a child, a young child, and vague memories, of people of places, were far too distant to be either clear or accurate. "It is surprised to see you, Master George," said Mrs. Hughes answering the door. "We could have easily come over to see you." He stood at the threshold of the cottage door, white roses growing up the eaves. George Crawley pushed them away to one side. No, I wouldn't hear of it," he told them. "I need to ask you for a favor, or for you to share your recollections, if I may." The once housekeeper smiled, and nodded. "Oh yes, please, certainly." "Come in," Mrs. Hughes invited, as a voice called to ask who was there. "Master George, Mr. Carson," she called back. then put a hand towards the living room. "Won't you stay for tea? I would really like a cup of tea, Mrs. Hughes," George Crawley told her, and she showed him into the sitting room. Never go into the sitting room of someone lower than yourself, never sit down, never accept tea, his mother had told him. Yet, she had those rules, and they all went to Granny Talbot's, or Granny Isabel's. People were people, and generally, George got on with everyone. "Lord Grantham," Mr. Carson told him, from the chair by the fire. He tried to his feet and was aggrieved when George waved him back down. "Dear Mr. Carson, you are nearly 90 years old. Please don't get up for me," George insisted, and put out an arm so the elderly butler could rest upon it to help himself sit back down. "As you wish, your lordship," Carson conceded, accepting, grudgingly. "I came to discuss a person of the acquaintance of Mr. Barrow," he told them a few minutes later, when the Royal Downton Cup was in his hand. "I wonder if you know that we have had of late a young man arrive at Downton. A young man whose mother was in the acquaintance of Downton many years ago?" He glanced away, and addressed the floor. "I need to be able to talk to you frankly, someone at least." He looked back to Mrs. Hughes and Mr. Carson. "God knows that my mother, in all her rationality, has still lost our beloved papa. He is missing, your lordship," Mr. Carson corrected him. "Your father was missing, in the Great War," he returned. "Missing in Burma," George told them, and ran his fingers through his hair, "which is now overrun with the Japanese. Heaven knows, he was only supposed to be in Singapore on business, and then got himself into mechanics with a new engine. And that was the last we heard of him. No, I cannot discuss this with mother, nor anyone else. It is all too inflammatory, considering the dreadful, ghastly war we have all been a part of." "It is because this young man is a German?" asked Mrs. Hughes. George looked at her, remembering her insight, remembering her humanity. "It was why he was here, was it not? I understand his mother was dear to the house. Someone who people know, but barely talk of." "I want some truth, Mrs. Hughes, Mr. Carson," he told them. "For if this boy's mother is as dear as everyone says she is, then he deserves a fresh start." "Whom do you mean?" asked Carson, looking at him, intrigued. "It turns out her name is Melusina Ashby," George told them. "I've heard her called Milo." "Is she well known at Downton?" "Well thought of." "Not it if she has had a baby on the other side of the sheet." "It is not," Carson exclaimed, shifting with displeasure in his chair. But his wife laid a steadying hand on her husband's arm. "Oh, Melusina!" she exclaimed, her face wrinkling as she thought of the young woman, the young girl who had once been a bright little spark in all their lives, with all the chaos that came with untamed flecks of fire, too. She was indeed, Master George, she was indeed. "Now hold on," said Mr. Carson to his wife, sharply. "You realize that that young woman was once married to Mr. Barrow?" "And was, until the end of her life," George Crawley told them. "The boy, Ernest, showed me their wedding certificate. It seems that Miss Ashby left it with his adopted family in Germany, along with his birth certificate, and a letter. My father witnessed the marriage," George continued, "as did my grandmother." "Then she is nothing but a shameless," began Carson, but Mrs. Hughes turned to her husband. "Let his lordship speak," she told him. "You can pass judgment on Milo's morals later, although, knowing her, there must be some sort of explanation for this. Melusina was far from the Scarlet Lady. Do you know that she gained the reputation for being a highly respected scientist in her own rigged? Worked with men who have gained Nobel Prizes?" "I did not know that. Why is she not more well known?" "I don't think she wanted to be," Mrs. Hughes conceded. "I don't think Barrow did either. But, oh, you talk in the past tense, Master George." And George Crawley found himself nodding at the sorry news. "Mr. Barrow informed me that Miss Ashby had been killed in fulfilling her duty to her country," he told them. "At what, or where, he does not know, of course. 2 years ago, her body unrecovered." "Oh my goodness!" exclaimed Mrs. Hughes, her hand to her mouth, and she turned to her husband aghast. What if her war work was something to do with what she was working on here at Downton? What? George asked. That was news to him. Miss Ashby was working on some kind of radio, some kind of transmitter, here at Downton. She had some sort of mast on the roof, one at the church. Gained quite a bit of prestige for it. We had all sorts of scientists come one night, as she presented it all to them. Quite a boon for your grandfather, I can tell you. At Downton? Yes, at Downton, Mrs. Hughes told him. And now her son has come to Downton too? She looked to Carson, to share in her obvious delight, but her husband had turned away. I do not wish to hear this, he told them, firmly, then looked to his wife. May I remind you, Mrs. Hughes, you turned away a maid for less than this, Ethel? And it is something I have always regretted it, Mrs. Hughes told him. Whatever reason Miss Ashby had for, well, bringing this child into the world, then, by all accounts, she had him adopted in Germany, George Crawley told them. And when he lost all his adopted family there, fled to England, looking for Miss Ashby. Mrs. Hughes smiled. And he found us, said Mrs. Hughes, reassuringly, the people of Downton. And, oh. She broke off, he found Mr. Barrow. What does he have to say about this? He positively dotes on the child, George told them. I have never seen him like this, defending the boy, encouraging him. He has got him into the school, a job WTH the Davis farm. And I can see why you would want to protect the boy. It does you credit, Mrs. Hughes told George. Is he as clever as she was? Oh, of course, how can you tell that? You were only a child when she was last here. And yet, George found himself thinking, I feel I do remember her. She was tall, with fair hair. She was sitting, in his memory, beside a bed, holding someone's hand. I have spoken to my friend, in the Home Office, from whom I received a letter. His existence and presence at Downton is well known, and I have stood surety for his word, based on the documents I have seen. It had taken a lengthy telephone call and 2 letters before Humphrey Swan had called to confirm Ernst Scholz was settled. But he needs to be adopted, or sponsored somehow, old thing, he told George. Not by you. It would affect your inheritance and titles, of course. But, if he wishes to stay, he needs a parent. Does he wish to be adopted? Mrs. Hughes asked George. I don't know, George told her. But it should be fairly straightforward. From that I understand that someone needs to claim him. And his background, him being German, has already caused issues at the school. I would think that a new name would suit him, and someone to take care of him. If he wants that, Mrs. Hughes pressed. He will. Of that I am convinced. He has fitted into life at Downton very well. Has he? If he has been fighting? Carson asked. He is just frightened he has no one back to in Germany. Mr. Millsley says he is outstripping the boys in the 4th form in every subject, and has gone beyond his own skill to teach him mathematics. The head teacher too. Then you have your answer, said Mrs. Hughes. It is the kindest, most humane thing to do, to bring in a wee orphan. But you have the hardest task in front of you now, she told him. You need to find out who would adopt this boy. 88,888,888, and that was the question, the one he put to Thomas Barrow, a loaded question, Caroline had told him, but for good effect. It was the evening, and George's sister was with him, as was his mother. Of course I know what I'm doing. That child has no more guilt in him, growing up where he did, than any of us can help our birth, Caroline had told George, but in telling her brother had really been telling their mother. And that was all she would admit, George thought to himself, for their papa's disappearance, presumed death, was uppermost in all their minds. He is downstairs now, Master George, Thomas told him, when he came up, after the message came for him to attend the drawing room. And it is settled as far as I am concerned, because Daisy had been right. To adopt Ernst was surely the best idea. It was her best idea in a long time, Thomas reasoned. Better, even, than marrying Andy and taking on the farm beside the ever-hardy Mr. Mason. He has been very quiet recently, Thomas conceded, after the incident at school. But he is excelling, and he seems to be thriving on T. Davis Farm. You think you know someone who would adopt the boy, then? Lady Mary asked, her face rigid, unreadable. Designed like that after years of practice. I will, Thomas told them. I was married to his mother. He can be my son. I will adopt him. And the legality? Lady Mary asked. I have a cousin who is a solicitor whom I can consult. And Thomas's mind went to Freddie Bonner. He had not seen him in some time. He wondered how amused he would be Thomas turning up, the last time for settlement over Milo's money and assets, this time over her son. But it was all clear in his mind. George's proposal had seared through the day's mass of thoughts and memories like a knife through butter. Chadwick had given him so many letters, he could not possibly read them in one go. But, regardless of what Milo had tried to say to him over the years, Thomas knew this was the right thing to do. He felt it. Ernst could live at Downton, have all the chances a world after a war would give him. He could be his son. Well, it will bring some life to the place now the evacuees have gone. Miss Sibby's scheme. So like her mother, Lady Mary mused. I wish I had known her, George told her, and his mother gave him the rarest of smiles. She was the kindest, sweetest, most determined person I ever knew, Thomas put in. Fair-minded, intolerant of injustice. Then in Sybil's name, we will take on Milo Ashby's son, Mary Crawley told them, and got to her feet. I am pleased for you, Barrow, she told Thomas, and I will put you onto our man, Nasabai, to ensure everything has been covered. I am sure your cousin would do an excellent job, but as it involves the family, I quite understand, Lady Mary, Thomas told her, and I am grateful. And his chest flickered happiness within it, at the thought of the course of his life now. Ernest, Milo's son. So, that's settled, George Crawley said, getting to his feet. If Ernst should want that, Thomas replied. Why ever should he not? Lady Mary asked him. She got up and smoothed out her clothes. Keep the radios on, do, she told them, a pain flickering over her features. The war is not over in the Pacific. We should keep an ear on proceedings there. Lady Mary then excused herself to bed, and Master George dismissed Barrow, saying he was going to catch up with his correspondence. Thomas nodded a goodbye and voiced a thank you. His thoughts caught up as he went back downstairs. Ernst was asleep, the blankets slowly moving up and down in bed as Thomas pushed open the door of the under-housekeeper's room. As he closed it, he saw Daisy heading out along the passageway. She and Andy now occupied the chauffeur's cottage with the twins, and it was a short walk across the yard to their home. Thank you, Daisy, Thomas told her, as she lifted her coat down from the hook. Thomas handed her her hat. What for? Daisy asked, eyes wide, full of wonder. Your idea, Thomas smiled. Which one? Your best one, he told her. And Thomas let Daisy leave without actually telling her. Time would come when everyone would know. To think she once was soft on him. But she adored Andy, and doted on the twins. He really would have to speak to her about Flora and Ernst. But there were other things he needed to do first. As the kitchen door closed, Thomas locked it, and began to walk back down the passageway. His hand drifted to his pocket, and then, without him realizing he had pulled them out, the letters Chadwick had given to him were in his hands. And then it was night, and Thomas was in his room with years' worth of letters from Milo. He did not know how long he spent that evening reading them, nor how often he had cried, how many times he broke down at her words, at her phrasings, her hopes that he was well, her successes, and her fears, and how Milo had asked him what he had thought of various things. And then it was the morning of his birthday. It was only when the shimmering dawn appeared, light glancing through the curtain's edges, that he realized his face was damp from tears. And Milo was with him once again,